There's a lot more to you than meets the eye. But it won't be released unless it has to. And so you're not going to even figure out what it is until you put yourself in peril. Now, part of that you might think, like, imagine that you're an introvert and you're socially awkward and you're highly neurotic, so you feel a lot of anxiety and depression. You don't like going to parties, and that's because the horrible tyrant lives at parties and always glaring at you and judging you and telling you how useless and insufficient you are. And so you go there and you don't even look at people because you know that if you did look at them, you'd just see the face of the judgmental tyrant, which, by the way, you wouldn't if you actually looked at them, but you won't because you avoid. And so you're going to go there and you're going to put yourself in this terrible situation, and if you're lucky and you're a bit awake, then you're going to incorporate all sorts of information from the external world that will help you develop your social skills and make you more sophisticated. And even if that doesn't happen, you're going to learn that you can tolerate your own fear. And you might say, well, what's better? To not be afraid or to know that you can handle being afraid? And obviously to not be afraid. But give that up, because that ain't happening. So the next best thing and the realistic thing is to know that you're the master of your own fear. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about in relationship to classical theories of personality is exactly that. It's not that the world isn't terrible. It's that the world is terrible. But you're a lot stronger than you think. And the way you... Okay, and so part of that is the strength that you gather is partly the information that you gather when you go somewhere that you're not good at, so you're establishing new skills like you have at university. But there's another part that's interesting that's related to the little video that I showed you at the beginning. DNA turns out to be a very complex structure. And so if I put you in situation A, then DNA codes certain kinds of proteins that help make up the way that your mind is and the way it works. But if I take you and I put you in another situation, completely different genes turn on. And so what that means is that you have a biological repository of potential use lying dormant at the highest resolution level of your molecular structure. And that if you push yourself in all sorts of different directions and you find different things to pursue and test yourself against, then you're going to turn on parts of yourself that aren't currently on. And God only knows what you'd be like if you turned yourself completely on. And maybe I could use a better metaphor. If there's a initiation archetype, which I kind of just described to you, which is, you can do this to yourself. I'll tell you how. And this is a good way to live. It beats the alternative anyway, which is like the definition of a good way to live. So imagine you're trying to pursue something. So you got a goal. That's a good thing. You got to have a goal. And you don't want to hold on to that too tightly because you might be wrong. So you got to be willing to let that go and have a different goal. But you need a goal. And then, while you're pursuing the goal, you're going to find out that there's some obstacles in your path, obviously. And maybe some of those obstacles are of a frightening type. Or maybe they're even of a disgusting type. You might say, I don't want to turn into that kind of person. So those of you who are sort of socialist, utopian left-wingers might think that way about business people. It's like I would recommend that you get over it as rapidly as possible. So anyways, you might think there's no way I'm going to act that way. So you sort of put it off limits, say. Or maybe you're afraid to do what you need to do next. Well, here's a rule. Don't avoid doing things because they make you feel negative emotion if you have to do those things in order to pursue your goals. In fact, you should do exactly the opposite. So let's say you're pursuing a goal and you find that you're afraid about something and so you're avoiding it. The first thing you should think is, aha! Look, I'm afraid of something and I'm avoiding it. Dragon. Treasure. Exactly there. And that's exactly right. It's precisely right. If you're afraid of the thing, then what that means is that you're not developed enough to handle it. And you need to be. So you should think about that as a discovery, like a positive discovery. You found out where you have a weakness, and you're now able to address it. So, if you're an introvert and you think, it's Friday night, I could go to this party, but, I really don't want to. Then you think, oh, that means I should go. And that's exactly right, because you already know how to do the things that you know how to do. And it's the things that you don't know how to do that bother you and oppress you. And of course those things are going to be difficult to learn about. But you need to learn about them because you need to get yourself all switched on. How's that? Switched on. Because then you'll be able to tolerate the fact that life is fundamentally suffering. And so you don't The world doesn't get safer as you develop. In fact, quite the contrary. You just get more competent. And that's better anyways, because it's conceivable that you don't want safety anyways. You probably want adventure. You probably want to be compelled. You probably want to be engaged. You know, if you want security, you might as well be dead. Well, because nothing's happening then, and there's no danger left. To be alive is to be contending with the world. And you want to be the best at that you can possibly be. And that's partly what we're going to learn about as we go through the entire course, but certainly the elements that have to do with clinical psychology. Because all of them circulate around this fundamental theme. They have to, because it's the fundamental story of mankind. And we want to know what that fundamental story is, because you're all human, and you need to know the story. When things fall apart, it's not like you just fall apart psychologically. It's not just a psychological condition. You know, if someone's betrayed you deeply, that might be because you're naive and unready, and maybe that's a psychological element. Maybe you're just young and you don't know better, and you couldn't. But there's also the real fact of the problem that you have in fact been betrayed, and now you don't know what to do. So there's reality in it as well as just what's psychological. And so one of the ways that you might construe personality theories that have to deal with a description of the way people are and a description of how they might move towards mental health is that they're maps that tell you they're maps of that landscape that tell you how to orient yourself so that you can succeed. And even better, and this is a Piagetian idea, it's not only so that you can succeed, it's so that you can succeed in a way that your family succeeds, so that they can succeed in a way that society succeeds, so that everything works better at the same time. And that's really success. And that's like you're winning a game that everyone wants to play. Well, what a deal. You get to move forward and everyone else gets to enjoy it. Well, that's a good definition of success. It's an archetypal definition of success, actually, because if you succeed properly, then your success benefits everyone else. So, hard to imagine that there could be anything particularly wrong with that. And so, in this unbelievably protected environment, you can think, oh, well, we should go easy on nature because isn't it so beautiful? It's like, yeah, well, yes and no. And it's not all beauty. It's certainly not, because nature will eventually kill you. So, even if it doesn't, well, it's going to kill you. It will also make you sick. It will also make everyone that you know sick, and it will kill all of them too. So it's not such a bad thing to have a little bit of empathy for human beings, given that we have to contend with that. And if we're destroying everything, which we're not, it's also returning the favor. So, all right, so there's the substrata. At the bottom of things, there's this terrible monster. But it hoards gold, and so encountering it, defeating it, challenging it, facing it, can be unbelievably productive. And that's a symbol of the absolute unknown. That's where you go when things fall apart. You don't know where you are, so where are you? You're where you don't know what things are, and that's a place. And what's interesting about it is that there are rules to act in that place. And that's what's so helpful, because, if you're in a place and you don't know what to do, and that's that, you're done. But if there's a pattern to what you can do in a circumstance like that, then you land on your feet and you're ready to contend, and maybe the trip down into the underworld is something you can undertake on your own accord, and you can come back with the treasure instead of ending up as dragon food or worse. And then when you're conceptualizing your relationship to other people, well, let's say to society, first of all, it's like, yeah, obviously you face a tyrant. Of course you do. But that isn't all you face, and you need to be grateful for what you've been given by your culture. And you actually have to understand what that culture is, because it's you. And if you don't rescue that part of you and that part of the culture, then everything gets dead and stale and tyrannical, and everything goes immediately to hell. And that's not a good thing. And then with regards to nature, well, you obviously have to appreciate the positive element of nature, and you have to enter into a relationship with it. But you don't bloody well want to forget that, things are out to get you. And you have to be intelligent and ready and awake so that you can prevail against that. And you have to be grateful for what you've been offered by other people and by the tremendous efforts of all of human culture across all of time that's put you in a position where you're so unbelievably privileged and have so many opportunities at your disposal. Well, so that's kind of the archetypal story of human beings. we always face nature. And it's always on our side. We always face our culture. It's always on our side. And we always have ourselves and those things that are arrayed against us, internally, externally. And that's you could say that's the existential world. It's the world of drama. And the things that are really compelling to you as means of communicating, use those categories to provide you with information. Because what you're trying to figure out is, if that's the landscape that makes up your being, so that's a phenomenological idea, how is it that you weave your way through it? This is the Peter Pan story, roughly speaking. Peter Pan is this magical boy. Pan is the god of everything, roughly speaking, right? And so it's not an accident that he has the name Pan. And he's the boy that won't grow up. And he's magical. Well, that's because children are magical. They can be anything. They're nothing but potential. And Peter Pan doesn't want to give that up. Why? Well, he's got some adults around him, but the main adult is Captain Hook. Well, who the hell wants to grow up to be Captain Hook? First of all, you've got a hook. Second, you're a tyrant. And third, you're chased by the dragon of chaos with a clock in its stomach, right? The crocodile. It's already got a piece of you. Well, that's what happens when you get older. Time has already got a piece of you. And eventually, it's got a taste for you. And eventually, it's going to eat you. And so Hook is so traumatized by that he can't help but be a tyrant. And then Peter Pan looks at traumatized Hook and says, well, no, I'm not sacrificing my childhood for that. So that's fine, except he ends up king of the Lost Boys. In Neverland, well, Neverland doesn't exist, and who the hell wants to be king of the Lost Boys? And he also sacrifices the possibility that he'll have a real relationship with a woman, because that's Wendy, right? And she's kind of conservative, middle class, London-dwelling girl. She wants to grow up and have kids and have a life. She accepts her mortality. She accepts her maturity. Peter Pan has to content himself with Tinkerbell. She doesn't even exist. She's like the fairy of porn. She doesn't exist. She's the substitute for the real thing. And so, but the dichotomy that you're talking about is very tricky, because there's a sacrificial element in maturation. Right? You have to sacrifice the pluripotentiality of childhood for the actuality of a frame. And the question is, well, why would you do that? Well, one reason is, it happens to you whether you do it or not. You can either choose your damn limitation, or you can let it take you unaware when you're 30, or even worse, when you're 40. And then that is not a happy day. And I see people like this, and I think it's more and more common in our culture, because people can put off maturity without suffering an immediate penalty. But all that happens is the penalty accrues, and then when it finally hits, it just wallops you. Because when you're 25, you can be an idiot. It's no problem. Even when you're out in a job search, it's like, well, you don't have any experience and you're kind of clueless. It's, yeah, you're young, it's no problem. That's what young people are like, but they're full of potential. Okay, well, now you're the same person at 30. It's like people aren't so thrilled about you at that point. It's like, what the hell have you been doing for the last 10 years? Well, I'm just as clueless as I was when I was 22. It's, yeah, but you're not 22. You're an old infant, right? And that's an ugly thing, an old infant. So part of the reason you choose your damn sacrifice, because the sacrifice is inevitable, but at least you get to choose it. And then there's something that's even more complex than that in some sense, is that the problem with being a child is that all you are is potential, and it's really low resolution. You could be anything, but you're not anything. So then you go and you adopt an apprenticeship, roughly speaking, and then at least you become something. And when you're something, that makes the world open up to you again. Like if you're a really good plumber, then you end up being far more than a plumber, right? You end up being a good employer. Not that plumbers, I'm not putting plumbers down. It's like, more power to plumbers. They've saved more lives than doctors. So, hygiene, right? So, if you're a really good plumber, well, then you have some employees, you run a business, you train some other people, you enlarge their lives, you're kind of a pillar of the community, you have your family. Once you pass through that narrow training period, which narrows you and constricts you and develops you at the same time, then you can come out the other end with a bunch of new possibility at hand. And Jung talked about that. He thought that the proper part of the proper path of development in the last half of life was to rediscover the child that you left behind as you were apprenticing. And so then you get to be something and regain that potential at the same time. Very, very smart. Well, he was very, very smart, so that's very wise thing to know. So, yep. Sacrifice. We'll talk more about that too. You get to pick your damn sacrifice. That's all. You don't get to not make one. You're sacrificial whether you want to be or not. That's a good thing to know as well. So even though it's rather, it's a rough thing to figure out. But other questions?
I have one if no one else.
Okay.
That thing you just said about noticing it more and more in people late into their 20s.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Where do you think that comes from in terms of the culture we live in?
I think universities facilitate it. Because you can go to university to not be something instead of going to university to be something. And it's Pleasure Island. And the price you pay for it, especially in the US, is debt. And you're enticed into it because the administrators can pick your pocket. So they rob your future self while allowing you to pretend that you have an identity. Right? Very nasty. And you can't declare bankruptcy with your student loans in the US. It's indentured servitude. And it's precisely Pleasure Island. It's exactly that. And so tuition fees have shot way out of control. And part of the reason that universities don't make more demands on their students and let them get away with all the things they let them get away with is because they're basically, why the hell would you chase them out? They're $100,000 or more. So they can do whatever they want as long as you get to sell them to the salt mines. Right. So, and it's not the only reason, because the other thing that's happened is that the rate of technological transformation is so fast now, and the rate of turnover of things is that it is genuinely harder for people who are, say, 18 to 20. When I was a kid, roughly speaking, the kind of rough patch for life was probably 14 to 17, something like that. Now I think it's 18 to 25. Something like that. And I think the reason for that is that all the jobs that the bloody hippies complained about being doomed to in the 1960s have now disappeared. Their problem was, oh my God, I'm going to go have to work for a corporation and get a salary for the rest of my life. And then I'll just end up in it with a pension and that'll be my whole life. It's like, well, it seems like a lot better deal than an endless round of part-time Starbucks jobs. So, some of it is that. There's a space now in our culture that is lacking for people to make that transformation from adolescence into adulthood. And so it's the cost of that is forestalled. But it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. So I want to tell you about a book today. The book is called The Gulag Archipelago. You ready? The book is called The Gulag Archipelago, and it's by a Russian author, a Soviet author named Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was in the Gulag Archipelago concentration camp system for a very long time. He had a very hard life. He was on the Russian front when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union in the early stages of World War II. Now, Hitler and Stalin had signed a non-aggression pact. And Hitler invaded the Soviet Union anyway. And from what I've been able to understand, the Soviets had prepared an invasion force for Europe at that point, but were not concerned with having to defend their territory. And so they were caught completely unawares by Hitler's move. And the conditions on the Russian front were absolutely dreadful, and Solzhenitsyn was a soldier on the Russian front. And he wrote some letters to one of his friends, which were intercepted, complaining about the lack of preparation and using bitter, dark humor to describe the situation. And The consequences of that was that he was thrown into a work camp. The Soviet system relied on work camps, and so those were large labor camps of people who were essentially enslaved, many of whom were worked to death, often froze to death, working in conditions that were so dreadful that they're virtually unimaginable. Solzhenitsyn spent a very large number of years in these camps, sometimes in a more privileged camp because he was an educated man, and sometimes in worse camps. He also developed cancer later and wrote a book about that called Cancer Ward, which is a brilliant book. So he had a very hard life. There's just no way around that. To be on the front and then to be in a concentration camp and then to have cancer, that's pretty rough. Now, he wrote the Gulag Archipelago. He wrote a book called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich first. That was published in the early 1960s. When there was a brief thaw, Stalin was pretty much out of the picture by the end of the 1950s. There's some indication that he was murdered by Khrushchev, and Khrushchev became premier of the Soviet Union after Stalin. And there's some indication perhaps that Stalin was either murdered by Khrushchev and a set of his cronies, or when he was very ill, just before he died, was not helped, at least wasn't provided with any medical attention because of the intervention of Khrushchev and his cronies. Now, there's some indication as well at that point that Stalin, who was an absolutely barbaric in every possible way you could imagine, was planning to start a third world war. And he was certainly capable of doing such things because he had already imprisoned or killed tens of millions of people. Now, just after Stalin died, there was a bit of a thaw in the Soviet Union with regards to internal repression. In the early 1960s, Solzhenitsyn published a book called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which was a story about one day in the life, his life really, inside one of these so-called Gulag Archipelago camps. Now, he called it the Gulag Archipelago because an archipelago is a chain of islands. And so Solzhenitsyn likened the work camp system in the Soviet Union, which was made up of isolated camps distributed across the entire state. He likened that to a series of islands, and hence the metaphor. And One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich was one of the first publications released in the Soviet Union that dared make public what had happened inside these camps, at least initially. Now, that thaw didn't last very long, but that book had a tremendous effect. It's a short book. It's worth reading. After that, he wrote a number of other books, which are also, he's a great literary figure in the same category, I would say, as Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, which is like really saying something. You know, those two are perhaps the greatest literary figures who ever lived, with the possible exception of Shakespeare. He wrote this book called The Gulag Archipelago, which is published in 3 volumes, each of which is about 700 pages long. The first one details the origin of the oppressive Soviet system, at least in part under Lenin, and then its full-fledged implementation under Stalin, and the deaths of, well, Solzhenitsyn estimated the deaths in internal repression in the Soviet Union at something approximating 60 million between 1919 and 1959. Now, that doesn't count the death toll in the Second World War, by the way. Now, people have disputed those figures, but they're certainly in the tens of millions, and the low-end bounds are probably 20 million, and the high-end bounds are nearer what Solzhenitsyn estimated. He also estimated that the same kind of internal repression in Maoist China cost 100 million lives, and so you can imagine that the genuine historical figures, again, are subject to dispute, but somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. And one of the things that's really surprising to me, and that I think is absolutely reprehensible, is the fact that this is not widespread knowledge among students in the West, any of this, and it's because your education, your historical education, if you started to describe it as appalling, you would barely scratch the surface. These were the most important events of the 20th century, and they're barely covered at all in standard historical curriculum. You know something, I would presume, about World War II and about the terrible situation in Nazi Germany and the death of 6 million gypsies and Jews and homosexuals in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. But my experience with students has been that none of them know anything about what happened as a consequence of the repression of the radical left in the 20th century. And I believe the reason for that is that the communist system had extensive networks of admirers in the West, especially among intellectuals, and still in fact does, which is also equally reprehensible. And I believe that one of the consequences of that is that this element of history has been what would you say, under-examined, and certainly very little attention has been brought to it in the public school curricula, and there's absolutely no excuse for that. It was the worst thing that happened in the 20th century, and that's really saying something, because the 20th century was about as bad as it gets. And so, and the fact that these deaths on massive scale occurred, and the fact that we don't know that deep inside our bones is a testament to the absolute rot of the education system.